There are moments in life when everything seems to lose its flavor, shape, and even meaning. These are days when we look in the mirror and the silent question, "Why?" echoes louder than any answer. In these moments of darkness, it is not uncommon for suffering to settle in like an uncomfortable guest, one of those who arrives without warning and refuses to leave. But Viktor Frankl, a prisoner of the unimaginable horrors of Auschwitz, offers us a key that can unlock even the heaviest doors of despair. Suffering is part of the human condition, and it can indeed contain meaning. It is not about romanticizing pain, nor about seeking it out. It is about facing it with broader, deeper, more human eyes. Frankl shows us that when we can no longer change a situation, when the loss is irreversible, when the illness has no cure, when circumstances are completely beyond our control, the only thing we can still change is ourselves. That is where our ultimate freedom lies, to choose how we will deal with the inevitable. Imagine a solitary tree enduring a harsh winter. The wind batters it, the snow weighs down its branches, the sun disappears from the sky. Still, its roots, invisible to the eye, grow. They seek depth, not light. That's how we are in times of pain. When life doesn't smile, it's possible that we are taking root. Frankl invites us then not to run away from suffering nor to deny it, but to give it a name, a place, a function. Suffering from love is different from suffering from resentment. Suffering from a significant loss is different from suffering from having nothing to believe in. And this distinction changes everything, because when pain gains meaning, it transforms. It does not disappear, but it ceases to be sterile. It is easy to accept pleasure. It is difficult to accept pain. But it is in the lucid acceptance of suffering that maturity is born. Not passive resignation, but the courage to remain standing even with a wounded heart. Frankl does not say it is simple. He says it is possible, and sometimes that is all it takes. When everything seems dark, when the world seems like a maze with no way out, perhaps the first step is not to find answers, but simply to recognize that being lost is also part of the path. And that suffering, far from being a mistake in life, can be a silent invitation to depth, and in that silent space between pain and acceptance, the first trace of meaning can be born, almost like a seed forgotten in the cold. There are times when life seems to slip through your fingers like fine sand. Even the most important commitments, the most set goals, the most desired dreams suddenly lose their shine. Everything that once moved you now weighs you down. Everything that once made sense now seems innocuous. It is in this silence between what we were and what we no longer know how to be that one of the greatest human questions arises. Why continue? Viktor Frankl, walking among freezing tents surrounded by death and hunger, discovered a simple, brutal truth. Survival does not depend on food or shelter alone. It depends on a reason to keep going. A purpose. But this is not about great causes or heroic ideals. The purpose Frankl speaks of is personal, intimate, and non-transferable. It could be love for someone who is waiting for us, even if they are absent. It could be a mission that is still unfinished. It could be the simple need to bear witness, to tell the world what we have experienced. It could be writing, creating, teaching, caring. Anything that is beyond us, but that calls to us with a clear voice. He says that many of those who succumbed in the concentration camps did so not because of physical weakness, but because they no longer saw a why to resist. As Nietzsche, who Frankl often quoted, said, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." And this why can be reconstructed, rediscovered, reinvented. It's not about denying the void, but about digging deep into it until you find what's left intact. Faith in something, responsibility to someone, commitment to one's own conscience. A higher purpose doesn't have to be clear, it just has to be felt. It's possible that today you don't know what yours is. That's okay. No one wakes up enlightened. Sometimes purpose doesn't shout. It whispers. Sometimes it's not. In front of us, but behind us, in our memories, in the old promises we made to ourselves and forgot. Other times, it's out there, waiting for us to move, even if we stumble. Seeking a higher purpose is like lighting a candle in a tunnel. It doesn't illuminate the world, but it shows the next step. And it's that step that can save a life. Frankl doesn't promise us easy answers, but he invites us to ask ourselves one question honestly: if everything is taken from me, what is still worth it? When you find something that cannot be taken away, that is your purpose. When everything seems to be falling apart, when the meaning of the great structures disappears, your career, your relationships, your dreams for the future, perhaps what hurts the most is not the collapse itself, but the silence that follows. A harsh, almost cruel silence, as if life had lost its delicacy. But it is precisely there, in this empty space, that Frankl whispers something essential. The meaning of life is not always found in great achievements, but can be hidden in the small details that we almost always ignore. A sunset seen from a forgotten window, the smell of freshly brewed coffee on ordinary mornings, the lingering gaze of someone who still cares. A phrase read by chance that speaks more than 1,000 pieces of advice. A moment of spontaneous laughter, even in the midst of pain. These small, fragile, and ephemeral things sometimes carry an extraordinary strength because they resist even when everything else falls apart. And perhaps they are the thinnest and truest thread that connects us to the meaning of existence. Frankl tells us that even in the concentration camp, surrounded by hunger, disease, and death, there were times when a prisoner would look up to the sky and be moved by the orange glow of a sunset. Beauty, even amidst the horror, could still touch the soul. It didn't save him from suffering, but it did reconnect him to his humanity. In a culture obsessed with productivity, goals, and greatness, we have lost our sensitivity to what is simple. We have been taught that life is only worth living if it is to win, conquer, shine. But the truth, a raw and profound truth, is that often the meaning that sustains us does not shout, does not appear on social media, does not impress anyone. It simply exists, quiet, firm, discreet. Finding meaning in small things requires a rare kind of attention. The attention of someone who has been broken and has decided not to harden. Of someone who, having lost everything, rediscovers the value of that which cannot be bought. A touch, a gesture, a memory, a moment. Living with meaning, then, can begin with a small act, stopping, breathing, observing, being present. Life is still here, quietly telling you that it is not over. And sometimes that is enough to keep going until tomorrow. Because in the end, perhaps the meaning is not in the extraordinary, but in the art of perceiving what through distraction we call ordinary. There is an idea that has crossed the ages, from great thinkers to those who suffer in silence and anonymity. We are not free from our circumstances, but we are free to choose how we respond to them. Viktor Frankl, confined in concentration camps, was stripped of everything: family, name, profession, rights, future. Everything was taken from him, everything except one thing: the inner freedom to decide how to live in that moment. And this freedom, he said, no one can take away from us. This is one of the most revolutionary ideas of logotherapy, because it forces us to change the question. Instead of, why is this happening to me? We start asking, how am I going to position myself in this? Of course, pain exists, and trauma, and loss, and injustice. It is not a question of denying reality, but of accepting that within reality, however harsh it may be, we are still masters of our actions. Frankl saw people who, even when surrounded by cruelty, shared a piece of bread with another prisoner. people who, even when dying, still made noble choices. And he realized human dignity does not depend on the environment. It depends on the inner decision to remain human. And you, here and now, even far from a concentration camp, live in your own prisons, a job that suffocates, a relationship that hurts, a world that demands too much and welcomes too little. Still, between a stimulus and a response, there is a space. And in that space lies your freedom. Freedom is not doing whatever you want. It is doing what is right, even when everything around you says otherwise. It is keeping a clear conscience, even when the world is dirty. It is deciding that even if you suffer, you will not become bitter. This is not easy. It is heroic, but it is possible. Frankl shows us that even when the body is limited, the soul can remain whole, and that this decision, made in silence, is worth more than 1,000 protests or escapes. Because it reaffirms that you are still in control of what is essential, yourself. So if today you feel like you've lost everything, stop for a moment, breathe, and remember, you can still choose. You can choose honesty over cynicism. You can choose care over indifference. You can choose to move on, even when you're hurt, and that is freedom. In times of pain, emptiness, or disorientation, it is natural for our attention to turn inward. We seek to understand what is happening to me. Why am I feeling this way? What did I miss? What am I missing? But sometimes the deeper we dig inside ourselves, the darker it gets. Because the meaning of life, Frankl said, is not found by looking only at oneself, but by looking outside of oneself. We live in an era that idolizes the I, self-knowledge, self-help, self-realization. But we forget that there is something that only reveals itself when we shift the center of existence beyond our own navel. Frankl stated that true personal fulfillment happens when we turn to something or someone outside of ourselves. It could be a task, a cause, a project, a child, a patient, an idea, a promise. Something that calls us out of the bubble of suffering. Something that demands our presence, even if we are in pieces. In the concentration camps, he saw that those who survived with some emotional health were often those who still felt they had something to accomplish, someone to love, something to give. They were not obsessed with what they had lost, but connected with what they could still give. And that changes everything. Because when suffering isolates us, it traps us in a closed cycle of self-reference. But when we make a gesture, no matter how small, toward another, the pain does not disappear, but takes on a new shape. It transforms into empathy, into a bridge, into shared humanity. You may be going through a dark time, but someone, near or far, needs your listening ear, your care, your courage. And by offering this, you may discover something unexpected, that part of your healing lies precisely in giving, that the meaning that seemed lost was all along in the other. Shifting your focus from yourself is not abandoning yourself. It is finding yourself again in the act of loving, of serving, of surrendering yourself to something greater. It is in this movement of departure, from the I to the we, from the void to surrender, that meaning begins silently to return. There are pains that seem to never go away, scars that won't heal, questions that won't go away. And at certain times in life, pain isn't a visitor, it's a resident. What to do with it? Viktor Frankl did not shy away from this question. On the contrary, he looked at pain with firm, almost defiant eyes, as if to say, if I cannot avoid suffering, I can at least decide that it will not be in vain. This is what he calls redemptive suffering, transformative suffering, not the kind that shrinks us, hardens us, pushes us towards cynicism, but the kind that, when faced with awareness, deepens us, sculpts us, reveals us. Frankl saw this in the most extreme situations. Prisoners who, even living in inhumane conditions, managed to maintain a sense of dignity, choice, and interiority. And, oddly enough, They became more human precisely when confronted with the inhuman, not because suffering purified them, but because they chose to give meaning to what they were experiencing. This is the key. Suffering does not automatically transform us. It invites us to choose what we will do with it. We can become bitter, or we can mature. We can close ourselves off, or we can learn. And you don't have to be in a concentration camp to experience this. All you need is to lose someone, to be betrayed, to fail at something you deeply believed in. All you need to do is face one of those many ruptures that life has in store for us, and that always leave us facing a silent fork in the road. Either we sink or we become deeper. Frankl reminds us that there is an invisible, everyday form of heroism. Transform suffering into a mission. Make it a bridge, not a wall. Learn from it something we could not have learned otherwise. This doesn't mean justifying the pain, much less desiring it. It just means refusing to walk away from it empty. It means extracting, even if only little by little, something that makes us more compassionate, more aware, more whole. Because, in the end, perhaps the greatest personal growth doesn't come from the easy days, but from those moments when, even without understanding, we decide to continue and grow despite everything. We live in an age that sells happiness as a product off the shelf. Slogans, promises, ready-made formulas. Do this and you will be happy. Buy that and you will be complete. Avoid pain and seek only pleasure. But the paradox of happiness, and Frankl understood this as few others do, is that the more we seek it directly, the more it eludes us. It is not to be found in the byways of hedonism, nor in the paths of the ego. Happiness, he said, should not be pursued as an end, but as a byproduct of a meaningful life. In other words, you won't be happy by trying to be happy. You will be happy when you are engaged in something worthwhile, something that transcends yourself. Frankl saw this in his patients. Many of them arrived in a state of emptiness, of deep anguish, precisely because they had made happiness the center of their lives, and therefore they could not find it. They had everything they needed to be well: comfort, stability, freedom, but they were exhausted, lost. Why? Because they had confused pleasure with meaning. They had forgotten that happiness is not a place, it is a consequence. The consequence of truly loving someone, of giving oneself to a cause, of facing a challenge with courage, of suffering for something worthwhile. Frankl said, happiness cannot be achieved. It must happen. It happens when we are busy living, serving, building. It happens without us noticing. It almost always surprises us, like the breeze that comes through an open window without being invited. And perhaps this is one of the most mature lessons we can learn. Stop asking all the time if we are happy, and start asking, is my life being lived with purpose? Am I being helpful to anyone? Am I responding to what life is asking of me? When the answer to these questions begins to form, happiness appears. Not as euphoria, but as quiet peace, lasting meaning, an inner presence. So if you don't feel happy today, don't blame yourself. Maybe you're not lacking pleasure. Maybe you're lacking direction. There is an invisible force that governs us more than we realize. The idea that we are trapped by our stories, by the wounds that have marked us, by the childhood we did not choose, by the failures we have collected, trapped by fear, by guilt, by what they said we are. And then life gets narrower, until it seems like there are no more ways out. Only repetitions, only survival. But Viktor Frankl, in the midst of the most literal prison, the concentration camps, revealed a radical truth. There is always room for choice. Even chained, even humiliated, even stripped of everything that made him someone in the eyes of the world, he discovered within himself an inviolable space, There, he could still choose to surrender or resist, to hate or understand, to sink or seek meaning. Frankl teaches us that the essence of human freedom is not in doing what we want, but in choosing how to react to what happens to us. This choice, silent, internal, intimate, may not change the world around you, but it changes who you become within it. This is the basis of existential responsibility. Life puts us in situations we did not ask for, but it always calls us to respond. Respond with dignity, with courage, with humanity, even if it is just taking a step, or taking a deep breath, or deciding that you will not continue the evil you suffered. Yes, there are traumas. Yes, there are wounds that don't go away. But what you do with it, that choice is still yours. And no matter what they took from you, your voice, your hope, your direction, there is still a way. Not the way you dreamed, maybe not the easy way, but a way you can build, starting with yourself. This is the ultimate human freedom, said Frankl, to choose your path even when all seems lost. And by doing so, you don't just change your story, you rewrite the very meaning of life. Life is a constant conversation, a silent dialogue between the world and our being. It is not just about existing, but about responding. At every moment, at every challenge, at every pain, at every joy, life poses a question to us. Who are you in the face of all this? What will you do with what has happened to you? What is your response to this suffering, to this joy, to this existence? For Viktor Frankl, this question is not merely rhetorical. It is the essence of human existence. We are not just passive spectators of what happens to us. We are protagonists who, even in the face of absurdity, have the responsibility to respond. And this answer is not a ready-made formula. It is constructed in the silence of conscience, in the echo of daily choices, in the confrontation with circumstances. It can be an act of courage. It can be a gesture of love. It can be the decision to continue despite the fatigue. It can be the humble silence before the mystery. But above all, it is an affirmation of life, a refusal to be overcome by emptiness, by hopelessness, by apathy. When everything seems meaningless, when darkness seems total, life insists, "Who are you to me?" And it is up to you, with all the complexity, with all the pain, and also with all the strength that remains, to answer that question. The answer is often neither simple nor definitive. It is a process, a journey, a daily struggle. But it is this response, even if it is made up of small steps, that gives meaning to existence, that transforms suffering into meaning, that makes us human, because in the end, life is not just what happens, it's what we do with what happens. There are times when the world falls apart, when the future seems like a broken line, and the present unstable ground. When the pain is so deep that it seems to suck out hope, meaning the will to carry on. In these moments, the voice of doubt is loud, insistent. What is the point of living? Why continue? Is there really any purpose? But Viktor Frankl, who saw the worst of humanity and still found light, leaves us with one final lesson. A seed of confidence that can germinate even in the most barren soil. Life, despite everything, is a gift. Even when everything seems lost, when darkness seems to envelop everything, there is a spark, small, silent, that pulses. Trusting in life is not a blind certainty. It is a courageous decision, an act of faith in the possibility of the new, in the mystery of existence. It is choosing to believe that even in chaos, there is something waiting to be born, something that we do not yet understand, something that can transform us. Frankl shows us that this confidence is not born of comfort, but of the experience, of suffering lived with meaning, that even in the most desperate circumstances, there is room for hope, not as a guaranteed promise, but as an open invitation. Trust in life as you trust in a dark path, where each step, although uncertain, is also an affirmation that it is worth continuing. Because in the end, life is this paradoxical adventure, a mix of pain and beauty, of loss and gain, of silence and response. And as long as you are willing to keep walking, even without seeing the clear light, there is meaning, there is life, there is hope.